Most Diablo 2 characters end up spending a lot of their stat points into vitality eventually, after they have enough strength and dexterity to wear their gear, hit their enemies, and if they use a shield, have enough chance to block. But what about putting every single stat point into vitality and completely ignoring the rest? Well, that just seems stupid. Hello, I'm Sarfen, and in this video I'm making a brand new character and attempting to beat the game from normal to hell, and while doing so I have to put every single stat point into vitality. Is life maxing really a viable strategy, and with only my base level strength, will I be able to equip any useful gear at all? Well, let's find out. But first, a big thanks to Opera GX for sponsoring this video. Like you build your character the way you want to play, Opera GX lets you build your browsing experience the way you want it to be. Separate videos into floating, adjustable windows that you can overlay on top of what else you're doing, so you can keep watching your favorite YouTuber while you work, or grind away in your favorite game. Opera GX has built-in protection against pop-ups and intrusive ads, and also a built-in VPN so you can protect your privacy and access content from different regions without the need for extra software. You can set your location between Asia, America, and Europe for free, and with VPN Pro you can access over 3,000 servers in over 30 countries. Protect your entire setup, no matter what application you use, using next-generation VPN encryption for up to 6 different devices. Throughout the end of 2025 you can use code Eggplant to get 1 month of VPN Pro for free. With a large library of mods to pick and choose from, GX Mods lets you make the browser that you want to use. One click to install and gear your browser out with wallpapers, custom music and sound effects, custom fonts, icons, and more. And you can mix and match different mods, as well as turn on and off individual features. If you want cool dragons but cute anime sound effects, it's up to you. Getting up and running with Opera GX is quick and easy with the import feature. Migrate everything you need from your old browser, and it is also compatible with every Chrome extension. Use my links in the video description or the pinned comment to download Opera GX today. I picked the druid for this challenge for a couple of reasons. He gains a good amount of life per vitality and he has a few life boosting skills, which fit perfectly with the theme for this run. Now, I don't particularly like the druid, as I've joked about several times on my live streams, but I should say something nice about him for all of the druid fans out there. I know. The druid is my second favorite class from the Lord of Destruction expansion. The druid spawns with only 15 in strength, which seems a little low for someone who can literally turn into a bear, but at least he starts with a good amount of vitality, so I was off to a good start on my quest to become a big chunker. The easy way to play this would be to build a caster druid, and use his powerful elemental skills like Fissure and Tornado, and then use the all vitality restriction as a nice safety cushion. But I'm not about that life, I had another idea in mind. In my previous videos where I put all my stat points into strength and all my stat points into dexterity, my characters have turned into glass cannons, but since I was going all in on vitality this time, a stat which only boosts your life total, I wanted to attempt the complete opposite this time. I am going to try and become a dedicated tank, a concept which doesn't really exist in Diablo 2. I'm going to build my character around the Raven skill and other passive forms of damage, while I focus on tanking on the front lines with my druid. I'm actually not even going to allow myself to ever directly damage enemies myself with attacks or spells. So that introduced my first problem. What do I do at level 1 with no skills and no mercenary if I can't attack? Step 1 was to open chests in search of gold and trash that sells for gold. And step 2 was to browse vendors' inventories for Armor of Thorns, a stat which deals damage to monsters that attack you. With a Sash of Thorns and a Buckler of Thorns, I now reflected 2 damage to every enemy that hit me with a melee attack. And with that I was ready to start my noble cause of taking all damage possible on my way through the game, starting with the Den of Evil. 2 damage might not sound like a lot, and it isn't. I patiently waited for monsters to defeat themselves by hitting me. This was a slow process, but as soon as I got my first level up, the next part of my plan would kick into gear. When I hit level 2, I unlocked my first skill, Raven. This was actually one of the main reasons I wanted to do this build. I have wanted to try a Raven druid for a long time. Ravens are weird summons. Unlike most others, they are completely ignored by enemies. They don't even have a health bar. They just fly around and attack enemies for a set number of attacks, and then they simply despawn. And what better time to use a summon that can't act as a meat shield than with a character that's trying to be a meat shield. My first level up also brought me my first 5 stat points, which of course all went into vitality. The other stats, especially strength and dexterity, have all sorts of useful benefits for both offense and defense, but all I cared about on this character was buffing that life number as high as I possibly could. For the first few levels, the damage scaling of Ravens was actually great. each additional level gave more damage per attack, but I also got another Raven summon at the same time. Unfortunately, the skill caps out at 5 Ravens in total, which really is a shame, but for the start of the game, a few points in Raven was a big power spike. I hit level 6 and unlocked another skill that was perfect for this build, Oak Sage, a spirit summon that floats around the battlefield and passively increases the life of all allies by 30% at level 1. Since this character was life maxing, getting some skills that multiplied my life total was a no-brainer. I stuck with a level 1 Oak Sage though, in favor of maximizing my Ravens as quickly as possible for more damage. With 5 Ravens doing my bidding, I made short work of most of Act 1. When I reached the barracks, I rescued Charsy's hammer from the smith. I used the quest reward right away on a druid pelt, hoping for resistances, a socket, and a bonus to the Raven skill. Not too shabby of a rare for the early game, but it was lacking the most crucial part, the plus to Raven, and without that, even though the other stats were okay, I value the 9% magic find on my current hat higher at the moment. In the Catacombs level 2, I had one of the strangest looking maps I've ever seen, with the stairs from level 1 and down to level 3 right next to each other. I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like it before. I flew past the first act on the back of my Ravens, figuratively of course, not literally. Right now my Raven's damage was so good that I didn't really have to worry about much else, though I did already start having some trouble with tanking on the front lines against elite enemies, but I decided to push on and try to finish Act 1 before worrying about my survivability. And shortly after I reached the Catacombs level 4 where the first act boss andariel was waiting for me. I was level 13 with 85 vitality and 266 max life. I had 12 points into Raven for a total of 5 Ravens attacking 23 times each for 25 to 38 damage per attack. And that's actually really solid for this early into the game, especially when they all converged to attack the same target. Since andariel is known to enjoy a bit of poison magic, I drank some antidotes before the fight to boost my poison resistance, and then I headed into battle. I brought a mercenary with me into the fight, but she died so early in the fight that I'm not gonna bother to introduce her. Bosses deal bonus damage to mercenaries and summons, so the fact that my Ravens couldn't be attacked by enemies was really good for this fight. And once they all focused on andariel at the same time, she was defeated very quickly. So far so good for my tanky Raven druid. Before moving on, I hired a new mercenary, Amplisa, who has served me very well in previous challenges. And then I moved on to Act 2. Right away, a major downside of going all in on vitality was starting to show. Almost every item that Farah offered to sell me was red, because I didn't meet the stat requirements. Not being able to equip a decent sword or axe was not a problem, since I was not attacking anyway, but a tank that couldn't equip a decent armor did not sound like a winning recipe. Going for heavy armor with high defense was basically out of the question. I would have to focus on lighter armor with damage mitigation stats instead, like resistances, and then hope that my big life pool could handle the rest. But right now I could barely equip any armor at all. I had 16 strength when I entered Act 2, boosted by a ring with +1. The need for some damage mitigation was starting to become a pressing issue, but first I needed to somehow increase my strength to at least 20 or ideally 30. Until then I was going to struggle with my tanking duties, and had to rely more on moving around the battlefield to minimize the attacks I absorbed. After defeating Radamant for the extra free skill point, I decided to try and improve my gear at least a little bit. While Farah only sold cool new armor to strong heroes, L6 offered some lighter alternatives, basically the armor types from Act 1. He sold me a sash with 10 faster hit recovery and 25 lightning resist. Unfortunately, the sash only has one additional row of potion slots, but a good chunk of lightning resist was going to be nice for tanking the beetles in the desert. Drognan sold me a wand with 9 energy, and that wasn't really that great of a weapon, but 18 extra mana for spamming Ravens was better than nothing. And then a pair of gloves with 18 magic find. I was looking for resistances, but I simply could not resist. A counterintuitive problem with going for a high life total for survivability is healing. Especially in the early game, my life pool was approaching the 300 mark already, but healing doesn't scale with your life total in Diablo 2. The light healing potions that I could buy in Lootful Lane only healed for 60 points per potion, and at a quite slow rate at that. So despite my life total being very high, I was not really having any better sustain in drawn out fights compared to any other character. The lightning resist I got was very nice to have though, as I tanked a surprising amount of beetles on my way to collecting all of the quest items. The damage from my Ravens was really good, honestly much better than I had feared. But one problem with them was that they like to clump up and all target the same enemy and then slowly fly over to their next target, so the overall DPS when fighting multiple enemies was actually not that good, even if the single target damage was pretty strong. I just talked about potions already, but in the Arcane Sanctuary I made a note that my life total was 341 already, which is pretty high for Act 2, even towards the end. But since I had to rely on light healing potions to top me up, I had to drink 5 to 6 potions to fill my entire life pool back up from low levels. This was a very thirsty man. I reached Andariel at level 21 with a maxed out level 20 Raven skill with 1 point in a synergy for an additional 12% damage. With those damage numbers and 5 Ravens attacking 31 times each, one flock should be able to easily kill Andariel without needing to be resummoned. The single target damage from the Ravens were decent from the start, but now it felt really strong when they all converged on one target. The decision to rely on Ravens for my damage started out as a bit of a meme, but I kept being impressed by them. For now anyway, they would not hold up so well later in the game. And Andariel, well, that was easy. If I could only get my defenses up and running to a proper level to make my life pool drain slower, I might have a solid build on my hands. Well, solid by my standards anyway. I've been glazing my Ravens a lot lately, so let me rant about a team member that was not pulling their weight, Oak Sage. This gentle spirit really likes to float into danger and get killed. Don't get me wrong, plus 30% life is a really nice bonus, but the spirit itself only has 60 life, so in dangerous encounters versus strong enemies or big hordes, it got killed more often than not, which meant that I lost the life bonus when I needed it the most, making Oak Sage a very unreliable ally. I still used it since I had invested the skill point already, but I didn't like it. I moved through the jungle and the crossed areas quickly. Towards the end, the amount of damage enemies could deal to me started to really scale up, and I had still not done much about my defenses other than stacking vitality. Luckily, the end of Act 3 is quite cheesable. First, I stood outside of the temple in Travancore and watched as my burst plucked away at the High Council, while they were running back and forth in place instead of walking out the door and coming after me. This was not how I wanted to play this character. I wanted to actively tank, and I was going to make an effort to make that happen, but I wanted to finish the rest of the act first. And shortly after, I cheesed Mephisto in a similar fashion, standing in a safe spot while my flock of untouchable ravens did my dirty work for me. Now, there was plenty of room to improve my gear in terms of tankiness. I had somehow found myself in the very familiar situation of wearing almost exclusively Magic Find gear. Having 125 Magic Find for additional loot was definitely nice, but this was simply not the way of the all vitality druid. It was time to make some changes. Mephisto fell and the green plated belt that he dropped would have been a very nice belt for this purpose. Saigon's wrap gives 20 life and 20 fire resist. Not to mention double the amount of potion slots for more healing potions, but it required 60 strength to equip. 60! And that was just too far out of my reach to even be considered at this point. So, before heading to Act 4, I took a detour to farm chests in Lower Kurast for a while, mainly looking for charms in hopes of finding some with extra strength. Such charms would be one of the best ways for me to increase my strength, as they don't have any stat requirements on their own. They just sit in your inventory. And with only 15 strength, there were just so few gear options that I actually could wear at all, so kickstarting the strength game with just a little bit would help a lot. And charms also had the chance of spawning with a nice bit of resistances too, like this grand charm with 23 fire resist. I found some other goodies too, like a couple of rares. First, these gloves with lightning resist and strength, improving both my resistances and helping me wear other gear at the same time. And then this rare ring, which despite having 7 lines of text weren't amazing, but double resistances on a ring was nothing to sneeze at considering what I was wearing. And then also a rare jewel a little later, minus 15% stat requirement, great for this character, plus 4 to strength, great for this character, and 26 cold resist, great for any character. A very nice jewel I must say, especially for a challenge like this. I did this for a little over an hour, and I never found a single charm with strength, but I did find a bunch of other good items that improve my character regardless. In addition to the rares, I identified this ring with plus 4 to strength. I'd like my rings to do a bit more, but for now plus 4 to strength was a good deal. And then when I found a falcon mask with plus 1 to Raven and plus 1 to Lycanthropy on the very next run, I decided I was good for now and moved on to Act 4. But I wasn't quite done tweaking my gear yet. The druid helm was nice, but it needed 28 strength to be used. Between the gloves and the ring I found, I now had 21. I had also found enough low tier gems that I felt I could spend 2 flawed amethysts in a 2-socketed body armor for another 8 strength to be able to equip the druid belt. That allowed me to equip the falcon mask, plus 1 to ravens was a nice damage boost, and lycanthropy was a useful skill too. but I'll talk about that later. Having almost doubled my total strength opened up more opportunities than just the pelt. I had built up a big pile of gold from selling all of the crap that I couldn't use when looting lower Kurast, and as I now had over 25 strength, I could finally equip the belt. And the reason that this excited me was that it had one more row of potion slots compared to my sash. I decided to gamble for belts in hopes of finding a good rare. The first gamble got me one with 3 to strength, which was decent, but with so much gold saved up I decided to try for a better one. I gambled, and I gambled, and I gambled, and eventually I got one with 4 strength instead, and a little bit of mana. Not quite what I was looking for, but at least this one had 2 stats instead of 1. And to top all of that off, I bought this ridiculously expensive wand from Yamela. 103,424 gold. For some reason, I thought this was a good deal. The reason that this was so expensive was the many, for me completely useless, plus 2 skills for the Necromancer, but the thing that I was after was the nice looking plus 38 to lightning resist. I then moved out to conquer Act 4. With all of the new gear upgrades and some decent new charms, my elemental resistances were looking really solid. I did not manage to do anything about my protection against physical damage, but I was still happy with the upgrades regardless. And this was more what I had in mind for this character, completely surrounded by enemies but standing his ground, unbothered, just waiting for my army of ravens to create a pile of dead enemies around me without moving a finger, but I was just barely able to do so with heavy potion usage. I wasn't quite the tank I wanted to be yet, but it was good enough for now, so I pushed on towards Diablo. I tanked Isul for the quest reward of 2 free skill points, and a single mini-boss was not that hard to tank for me. Then I tanked Mephisto and his hammer for the reward of some gems and a rune. An amethyst would have been really nice to find, or one of the higher runes from the drop range, but unfortunately I didn't quite get what I wanted. And then I tanked the Chaos Sanctuary, or at least I tried to, with varying success. It was fine for the most part, but the Oblivion Knight's curse could quickly undo a lot of my efforts in improving my defensive stats, with the lower resist curse taking away a big chunk of my resistances, which I worked so hard to build up, or amplified damage, doubling my weakness to physical damage, so I did end up having to resort to dancing around the battlefield for some of the trickier fights, but as long as I could buy some time for my ravens to attack, we kept pushing through. As I approached the final seal to release Diablo, I leveled up, and that was good timing because I had one more trick up my sleeve to bulk up for the Diablo fight. I finally put a skill point into Werebear, for an additional, very significant life boost, and this is why that +1 to lycanthropy on the helm was so nice to have, because that passively increases both the life bonus and the duration of Werebear, without having to spend any of my skill points on it. Transforming into a bear, my life pool shot past 800 max, a very healthy number, and I looked a lot tankier too as a big furry bear compared to my weak human form. Did this mean that I could tank Diablo spells to the face? Well, almost. At least the first one with a full life pool, but definitely not all of them. But with a life pool this big, I could easily stay alive as long as I didn't completely stand still in his spells. And while I loafed around at the outskirts of the central platform, my ravens tirelessly pecked away at Diablo. And the fight was over quicker than I expected. I was messing around with my potions in my inventory, thinking it was time to resupply my belt for a drawn-out fight, when I suddenly noticed that Diablo was defeated. I have definitely underestimated you before, ravens. It turns out you're pretty alright. Starting Act 5 was a pleasant stroll in the woods compared to the Chaos Sanctuary. There was plenty of other strong men who took it upon themselves to tank the forces of evil. I did my best to help out too, but the barbarians did draw a lot of attention from our enemies, despite my best efforts to get in the way. Something else nice about Act 5 was that super health potions started to drop, the best health potion in the game, though they only heal for a total of 320 points. And when I summoned Oak Sage and transformed into a bear, that wasn't even half of my life pool. But at least they were much better than what I had before. Around this time is also when I had a huge discovery about my ravens. It turns out that you can direct the whole flock of ravens to whatever target you want. This might be a little bit tricky to show for the video since the ravens are kind of hard to see, but I'll try. If the ravens are currently engaged in fighting, but I click on an enemy with the skill, I summon one new raven at that enemy, but then the other 4 also leave their current target and fly over to the one I clicked. Then, if we have a similar situation, but I click to summon the raven on the ground close to an enemy, the new raven will summon where I clicked and start attacking a nearby enemy, but the other 4 will stay where they were. But then again, if I click on an enemy, all 5 ravens will start attacking that same enemy. Wow, my mind was blown. I had 2 thoughts about this. A, how could I not have noticed this behavior until now? And B, I was simply amazed to find that there was a summon in Diablo 2 which could be given commands, when all other minions are notoriously stupid and impossible to control. This gave me so much more control to snipe any enemy at will, like here where I took out Shank ASAP to trigger the catapult explosions to take out the minions. And if I ever wanted them to stop target firing and spread out, I could just target weak monsters in the general area where I wanted them to go, or spread them out manually by clicking on the ground. A very cool discovery, and it added a whole new layer of gameplay for this character. Now I could stand still and do nothing, while also doing something. I rescued 15 barbarians from captivity as a side quest and was rewarded with the runes Rel, Ort and Tal. I was planning on making the rune word Ancients pledge to upgrade my shield, but even though I had artificially boosted my strength to 33, that was not enough to wear any of the shields that can have 3 sockets. I was a selfish druid and only helped others for my own personal gain. After rescuing the barbarians for runes, I rescued Anya from the frozen river, this time for the reward of a permanent boost to all my resistances. Self-serving, sure, but let me ask you this. Anya was just saved from certain death. Do you really think she cared what my reason for saving her was? Is a good deed less good because the intentions behind it were not purely altruistic? You think about that while I continue to save the world for glory and loot. I reached the Ariat summit at level 30 with 175 points in vitality. My Raven skill was maxed, with most of my other points going into Spirit Wolf as a damage synergy for Raven. They dealt around 200 damage per hit now, which was still very decent, but monsters' health bars were definitely scaling faster than my Raven's damage now. With Werebear and Oaksage active, I was nearing the 1000 life milestone, though I was not quite there yet. As a little side challenge, with no rewards, purely for my own entertainment, I wanted to see if I could win the fight without moving at all and stood completely still after activating the altar, only turning in place to summon new ravens. Madak was quickly targeted down with precision pecking. The other 2 ancients were definitely among the tankier enemies my ravens had to wear down so far, but after a while, Talik fell to the flock as well. With 2 of them down, the fight was already over, because if 3 of them couldn't take me down as I just stood there, only a single one of them had no chance at all, and then Korlik was bitten by birds and the ancients were defeated. Remember my recent complaints of not being able to wear any 3-socketed shields? Well, I found a shale rune in the Worldstone Keep, and just like that I didn't need 3 sockets anymore. For 2-socketed shields there were plenty of lighter options, for example this bone shield, and with the shale rune and an F, I made Rhyme, a really solid shield with the main stat that I was looking for being the 25 to all resistances. It also has cannot be frozen, which is a great stat as well, and it's quite rare to find on items too, but as a big bear that was just standing around, being slowed by cold damage wasn't that big of a deal for me this time. I took on Baal's minion, and against the first of the waves I leveled up to level 32, and my life pool grew past 1000 for the first time. 1000 life, that's more than most of my characters have when they finish Hell. And reaching this number already in normal difficulty felt pretty cool, like an achievement of sorts. Tanking Baal's minions went perfectly fine for the most part, but against Lister and the Minions of Destruction I started to struggle, but only as far as my minigame of trying to face tank everything was concerned. Once I admitted that I couldn't stand still and started walking around, I was able to stay healthy, and watched as my ravens took care of Baal's final guardians. With the life pool the size of a large pool, I took on the final act boss of normal, Baal. I was feeling pretty strong, my resistances were looking great, with fire and lightning being at the cap, cold just 1 away from the cap, and with my poison resist sitting around a solid 50, and of course my 1020 max life. The damage from my ravens was still good, but not impressively so anymore, even though I still put all my skill points towards increasing their damage via synergies. My main weakness was still without a doubt physical damage, as I had no physical damage mitigation, and with a base level dexterity my block chances was in the low single digits. But with the rules for this challenge it was also kind of hard to do much about this problem at the moment. Baal suffered defeat by 1000 pecks, and with that I had beaten normal difficulty. All in all, things went pretty smoothly, but from here on our enemies would just scale stronger and stronger, and I would have to work harder to upgrade both my survivability and my Raven's damage. I did a quick pit stop in Harrogath and asked Larsuk to add sockets to my helm, and then I moved on to Nightmare. With the Nightmare penalty, my resistances were not looking as impressive anymore, but I decided to try and push on as far as I could before I worried too much about gear upgrades again. Partially because the further I progressed, the more options would open up, and partially because if I let myself get sidetracked and go grind for upgrades at every single opportunity, I would never make any actual progress. I traded in my Emplisa for another Emplisa with cold spells, hoping that Freezing Arrow could provide some extra crowd control for me. I did get a few small upgrades along the way. I found a small charm with 1 strength and a little bit of fire resist. Not much on its own, but it felt good to finally find a strength charm. Nightmare Andariel was my next real test, a benchmark of my tankiness if you will. Andariel took my mercenary and my oak sage down and then set her sight at me. I planted my feet and stood tall, but not for long, because she bursted my health down way too quickly. After a trip to town to once again fill up on antidotes to combat her poison attacks, things were looking better, but not good enough. Despite constant healing, including several rejuvenation potions, I could not stand my ground and I had to start running. I did still defeat Andariel, but at the time I had complete tunnel vision on tanking. I felt a strong need to increase my sustain in battle, especially against bosses, so when I moved on through Nightmare this was constantly at the back of my mind. After defeating Radamant for the Book of Skill, I maxed out my first synergy for Raven, and I was not sure what to do with my build next. On one hand, the Ravens were my main source of damage, and often my only source as Amplisa was struggling to stay alive, but with 20 points in synergies already, the marginal gain from additional skill points wasn't that big. Maybe it was time to put some skill points elsewhere to help improve my tankiness instead, so for a while I saved my skill points while I figured out what to do. In the Maggot Lair I found a unique bow, and as I had recently upgraded an Amplisa to the cooler version, this was a pretty sweet find. Wise and Draw. The base damage wasn't great, but it has the very unique stat of minus the enemy cold resistance, which would pair very well with Amplisa's cold skills. I found even more unique loot in the Arcane Sanctuary, the unique Gladius Bloodletter. Now that's a fine looking weapon, for a fighter. My lack of sustain was becoming a bigger and bigger problem, so in the Canyon of the Magi I invested a couple of skill points to get another summon, Carrion Vine. A very creepy looking worm summon that doesn't attack, but roams around the battlefield and eats dead enemies to heal the druid. Though as with Oak Sage, the summon itself was rather weak, having only 95 life and liked to slither into danger, so when the extra healing was needed the most, it often died. The extra healing was a nice addition, but it was not enough to keep me sturdy. By now I was really struggling to tank more than a few enemies at a time. The incoming damage was just too much for my healing to keep up. I had to rely more and more on the terrain, such as doorways, to keep myself from getting surrounded, but even then I was not really standing up to the hordes of evil, and I even started dying a few times towards the end of the second act. I pushed on through the tombs and eventually fought Duriel, and now even my boss tanking abilities were coming into question. I was doing alright I guess, but against Duriel I had to flee to town several times in the middle of the fight to heal and grab more potions, and this was not a good omen for the future. In the end I did beat Duriel in the second act, but now the gears were really turning in my head, trying to find a way out of this situation. I found a unique belt from Duriel, Night Smoke. A decent belt, but plus 10 to all resistances was probably not enough right now. So when entering the third act I started by taking stock of the situation. The problem with my gear was that it was hard to maintain good defensive stats for all the different damage types while also having to dedicate a few gear slots to plus 2 strength. I was scrambling to come up with ideas to mitigate the incoming damage, as getting better healing was not really plausible right now. But then when standing in town and theory crafting, it all came together like pieces of a puzzle falling into place. The druid's unique abilities, flashbacks to the usefulness of Amplisa's cold damage slowing enemies down, as well as the Wise and Draw bow that dropped, and all of a sudden I had a plan. Was it a good one? I didn't know yet, but on paper it seemed to solve several of my current struggles. First, I respec my build using the quest reward from the first quest in Act 1. Then I put all my stat points back into Vitality, at least that part was still very straightforward. And here's the big change, while my ravens had served me very well and still were perfectly decent to be honest. Single target damage was now much less of a concern than staying alive, so I opted for another passive damage dealer instead, Hurricane. Hurricane summons a gust of wind that follows the druid around and deals damage to enemies around him, and it deals cold damage, slowing down all enemies that are hit, which I figured would reduce incoming damage significantly. But that wasn't all. One of Hurricane's synergies, Cyclone Armor, was going to help with my gearing problem in a big way. Cyclone Armor completely absorbs fire, cold and lightning damage, meaning I could pretty much ignore those resistances from now on. The amount absorbed is limited, but since I wasn't attacking in fights, I could spam the skill to create a fresh elemental shield as often as I wanted, and this would allow me to focus my gear on physical damage reduction alone, which was not easy to do right now, but I had some plans for the future. Another reason for choosing this skill was the Wise and Draw bow. The minus 33% cold resistance was just perfect for this. When Amplisa wasn't looking, I nabbed the bow from her, but in the excitement of brainstorming a new build, I completely forgot about the vitality only restriction. You know, the whole gimmick with this character, and I was far too weak to meet the stat requirements for this bow. Hey Amplisa, you dropped something. Just picked it up for you, here you go. I was still running around as a bear for that juicy life boost, but now I had a raging storm of Mother Nature by my side instead of a small flock of birds, and when you put it like that, it does sound like a good respec. The AoE cold slow was exactly what I needed to tank my way through the many big hordes of demons and other monsters in the jungle, and finally having some area damage was so nice to have for questing as well. My single target damage against elites was noticeably worse compared to my max Raven build, but I was happy to make that trade for more chunking power, and with this newfound power I tanked my way through the jungle. I found Saigon's gloves in the jungle, and it's starting to feel like I'm finding some Saigons in every challenge run I do, though the set is pretty good, so I'm certainly not complaining. These gloves have plus 10 to strength, which was exactly what I needed to equip heavier gear, but the gloves themselves require 60 to be worn, so that wasn't looking too likely to happen. And then I got a pretty nice ring from Ormus as a reward for returning the Gid bin. Resistances were not as important anymore with Cyclone armor, but still, strength, magic find and some baby life regen, not bad. Now, about that single target damage being worse than before, let me reiterate that point by showing you one of the Mephisto fights of all time. Hurricane dealt about the same damage once per tick as one Raven did per attack, and there were 5 Ravens versus 1 Hurricane, so the math was pretty clear. And to make things worse, in general enemies resist cold damage more than they resist physical damage, and that was certainly the case for Mephisto. When standing close to Mephisto, he likes to fart poison clouds and swipe with his claws, and poison and physical were 2 of the damage types that was not absorbed by Cyclone armor. The poison especially was annoying, because even with antidote potions, he just kept poisoning me over and over again, and this fight was looking to be a long one. But by standing slightly further away from him, I could trick him into casting lightning and cold spells instead, which were absorbed by my infinitely recastable Cyclone armor. And a little over 5 minutes after the fight started, I finally wore Mephisto down, and his loot drop was pretty funny. You know how I said that poison was annoying for this druid? Well, he dropped a unique Chris, a weapon which massively increases your poison resistance and raises the resistance cap for poison too. And the set shield was Clay Gloves, a shield with 75% poison duration reduction. Okay game, I appreciate the gift, but poison wasn't that big of a problem. How about you give me something with physical damage reduction instead, Act 4 upped enemy damage significantly, so once again I was struggling to stand around in the face of danger, and I also started running into some very cold resistant enemies, like this very persistent knight who was also extra fast, making him very hard to run away from. And then Hephasto the Armorer, the Guardian of the Hellforge, was cold enchanted as well, making him slow to kill while still dealing lots of damage to me. And here's the thing, my new build allowed me to focus my gear on physical damage mitigation, but so far I hadn't really capitalized on that. Cyclone armor was great against the elements for sure, but I still fell short to the age-old strategy of just getting punched in the face, and it turns out that when you stand around on the front lines, you get punched in the face a lot. So after breaking on the Hellforge, giving me a not so useful Dull rune, I decided to go on a farming side quest to gear up before I even dared to enter the Chaos Sanctuary. There were a few ways for me to reduce physical damage. First, I could reduce my chance to get hit, which meant boosting my defense and my level. More levels were a solid option, but getting my defense to a high enough number to matter was going to be tough with my low strength not allowing me to wear heavy armor. Blocking is perhaps the best way to reduce physical damage, especially for a character that likes to stand still a lot. But again, with low dexterity, it didn't seem like a great option for this character. In fact, my Rhyme Runeward shield had a 60% base block chance, but my actual block chance? 3%. 3. The final thing I could think of was to get straight up damage reduction stats, like the damage reduced by 2 on my Night Smoke belt. 2 damage reduction wasn't a lot, but it's kind of hard to find this stat in big numbers, so I would likely have to stack a bunch of them together. I retreated back to the Countess in Act 1 to grind for runes. She was still by far the most reliable source, and in Nightmare her special rune drop could drop some new runes that would help me out a lot. Though after an Io rune on the second run, which is the highest rune from her special rune drop loot table in Nightmare, the grind was off to a slow start. But I was desperate for upgrades, so I stuck with it. After an hour or so, I finally found a Sol rune, the thing I needed to make a new hat. But not my original plan, which was to use Orton Sol to make lore in the helm that I socketed before leaving normal. That ended up being a wasted socketing quest, but for another, very strong helm rune word. But first, I needed a 3-socketed helm. Almost immediately after finding the Sol rune, I found a socketed druid pelt with +2 to Hurricane, but very unfortunately, just a single socket. If this would have rolled with 3 sockets instead, it would have been a great helm. I cubed Thal runes into an end rune. If I could only find a sword with 4 sockets now, I'd be looking at a very solid weapon upgrade. And eventually I did find that 3-socketed helm that I wanted, and it was a druid belt too. Unfortunately, no useful 3+ to skills, but it was a 3-socketed helm nonetheless, and with a very manageable strength requirement too. I found several more decent runes, amps, even more souls, and the like. I wanted to find a shale before moving on, and that's not a very uncommon rune at all from the Nightmare Countess, but that's just how loot is in Diablo 2 sometimes. The game knows what you want and then gives you the middle finger, but the game has to drop something, otherwise its scheme would be far too obvious, so I eventually managed to cube a shale from an excess of soul runes. The 11% physical damage reduction was unfortunately in the lower end of the roll range, but against big heavy attacks it would hopefully make a decent difference, and the 7 flat damage reduction would be nice when surrounded by lots of smaller enemies attacking fast but for less with each hit. But looking at my helm when back in Act 4, doubt that it was actually enough damage mitigation suddenly showered over me, and in a moment of panic and poor impulse control, I quickly slammed my last remaining soul runes into a 3-socketed breastplate, completely overlooking that my wonky purple armor accounted for 8 of my total strength, which was required to wear something like a breastplate in the first place. I felt pretty stupid at this moment, and to avoid having to explain how I used my last 2 soul runes and walked away with nothing, I made another questionable decision and put my good rare minus requirement jewel into the 3rd socket. Yeah, this was probably not the best use of resources, but the extra damage mitigation seemed to make a difference together with the life regen, because when I returned to the River of Flame I felt confident in tanking the forces of evil again, and I went on to the Chaos Sanctuary on my quest to face tank Diablo. Things were going fine, though I did have to keep an eye on Cyclone armor to make sure it was always up, because the Oblivion Knights could dish out some decent elemental damage otherwise. I even ran into a completely cold immune knight, though this one Amplisa could slowly handle for me. But the Seal Guardians were not immune to cold, so I made short work of them. I took the Vizier of Chaos down before I even figured out where I wanted to stand. Lord Deceased did put out some good damage with his multi-shot Bone Spirit attack shotgunning me through my Cyclone armor, but it wasn't enough to defeat me, especially after his entourage fell to my gust of wind. The Infector of Souls was a close call, with the demon's fire-breathing spam eating away my Cyclone armor very quickly. This was the first encounter where I truly needed to spam Cyclone armor over and over to stay safe, but that was the whole idea behind the build after all, so once I realized what was up, victory was assured. Cyclone armor absorbed Diablo's fire spells, my new gear ensured that potions outhealed Diablo's claw attacks, and Diablo's aim made his lightning attack go right over my head. Under these conditions, the fight against Diablo was merely a waiting game, exactly how I wanted it. My vitality was now up to 295, with my life total being a little over 1300. And that's without Oak Sage, by the way, because the occasional stray hit from Diablo spells was more than enough to one-tap the spirit. While looking at my advanced stats tab, I was surprised to see that my life regen was over 90. Where did all of that come from? Well, the answer was potions. I actually had no idea that an active health potion increased the life regen stat on your advanced stats page. But then again, I guess that's the thing you only notice when you have time to study your character screen in detail in the middle of combat. Another 5-minute or so fight in the books, and another Diablo defeated. Moving on to Act 5, I took Shank down to unlock another socketing quest from Larsuk, but having wasted my first one on an item that I never ended up making a rune word in, I held on to the reward for the time being, in an attempt to minimize the amount of questionable decisions in this video. Despite my recent efforts to become tankier, by the middle of Act 5 I had to once again start giving up on the playstyle of literally standing still. Despite Cyclone armor and my damage reduction gear, incoming damage was just too much against some types of enemies, but it turns out that moving around a little bit so that not all enemies can hit you at once is a good strategy. But as I was nearing the final difficulty, I slowly shifted my focus from playing a build in a funny way to focusing on actually beating the challenge. Though as I say that, I took on the Ancients next. And while I had to reset the first encounter because Madoc was completely immune to cold damage, the next attempt was looking very promising. I was able to tank all 3 of them at the same time, which was quite surprising to me, but it was certainly a welcome surprise. Hurricane and Amplisa ticked their health bars down at a steady pace. Talik was the first of them to fall, which was good news because he's usually the one who deals the most damage. Korlik was cold enchanted and Madoc has a high natural base cold resistance, so the remaining 2 were a bit slower to defeat. But if I could tank 3 of them, just 2 barbarians would certainly be no problem, and a little while later I defeated the rest of them. In the throne room I encountered some completely cold immune normal enemies, a taste of a big problem to come in hell difficulty. Amplisa could handle the odd cold immune that had to be cleared for the waves to begin, though at this time I realized that having a cold rogue as a mercenary was probably not the best idea to go along with my hurricane spell. I found a green Chaos armor, the armor from the Trang Ul set. Not that useful to me, but a cool find to get in Nightmare, and shortly after, a socketed Shadow Bow. Now a rune word in an elite bow could be my solution for getting some complementary damage from my mercenary, but with just 2 sockets, there wasn't anything too useful to make in this. The only wave of Baal's minions that caused a bit of trouble was the final one. I could tank decently well, but between their high damage and knocking me back, I couldn't keep Amplisa safe forever. But with some walking tactics, to thin them out, and reviving Amplisa on a trip back to town, we did eventually beat them. I was confident that Baal was not going to be able to take me down, but I was also confident that the fight would be a grind, truly a duel between 2 tanks with low damage output. But in a war of attrition, the one who brings an inventory full of healing supplies is at a significant advantage, and after 8 minutes of watching paint dry and only moving around a little bit when Baal teleported away, I defeated the final boss of Nightmare. I got 2 decent drops from Baal. First, the belt from the Immortal King set, with a massive strength boost, though the belt itself has a strength requirement of a whopping 110. And that was just never going to happen for this character. The boots were tear haunch, movement speed, stats, and resistances. Solid boots, but also with a hefty strength requirement. 70 strength also seemed unreasonable, but not impossible, so those went into the stash. I finished Nightmare at only level 56, which was lower than I would have expected because this character wasn't really rushing through and skipping too many enemies. Due to the nature of Hurricane, I actually ended up killing a lot. But I guess except for the short Countess farming session, I hadn't really done much repeat farming with this character yet. Though levels were important, so before moving on to Hell, I farmed Terror Zones in Nightmare for a little while, which in case you don't know is a zone that rotates to a different area every hour and increases the level of all monsters there. I found a unique armor rattle cage, which could potentially be an interesting one for the mercenary. Crushing Blow is weaker when used with ranged attacks rather than melee, but still a potentially useful stat to have for the high HP bosses of Hell. And I also finally found a crystal sword with 4 open sockets, which could be my base for Spirit if I could just scramble together a little bit more strength. I moved on to Hell at level 66, I had a massive 370 vitality by now, which in bear form with Oak Sage up translated to over 2000 life. Hurricane was doing decent damage, but it was certainly not holding up nearly as well in Hell as it was in Nightmare. And then of course, in Hell there are a lot more resistances on enemies, and straight up immunities. For example, every zombie in the first area of Act 1 is completely immune to cold damage. Amplisa still did some damage to them, but her physical damage was really low, so I started thinking about swapping out my cold Amplisa for a fire one again. Though before doing that I stuck around and cleared up some of the enemies I was fighting, and found a pair of green heavy boots. Sanders Rip Wrap, and these were pretty much perfect for this character, a total of 15 non-vitality stats and 40% run speed, very nice. I swapped my cold Amplisa back to another fire Amplisa at the Rogue Factory, and then I gambled both at Geed, because the Weisendraw was only really good with cold spells. I spent a lot of my gold and only got a single rare one, and it wasn't even that good of a bow, but I took it to the cube anyways to upgrade it to the exceptional version. It wasn't a very impressive weapon for taking on Hell, but at the same time it was certainly better than the Weisendraw with a fire rogue. Hell was a tough step up in difficulty, but it was still possible to progress through Act 1. I did have to run away from some big groups of nasty cold immune enemies, though I guess I could have tried to pull them apart into smaller groups and then let Amplisa pick them off one at a time, but there wasn't really that much to gain from doing so. But against enemies that were not cold immune, Hurricane was still looking strong. A steady stream of decent damage in a large area that slowed enemies down when hit. It was like playing 2 different characters when facing normal enemies and when facing cold immune ones. Heading into the final stretch of the act, I found a Grand Charm with a whopping +5 to strength, the biggest boost I had seen so far on a charm. And this finally pushed me over the 43 required for a crystal sword, so I made Spirit for the +2 to all skills and also 22 additional vitality. A very welcome weapon upgrade over the wonky lightning resist one that I was still using before this. I made it down through the catacombs, and I guess the early outdoor areas really had a lot of cold resistant enemies in them, because I actually felt stronger and stronger the further into the act I progressed. Boss fights in Hell were going to be tough for a character such as this, but at least for Andariel, I came prepared. After clearing out most of the random trash mobs, I went back to town and my stash. First, I equipped Cleglov's shield that I had saved in the stash for that poison length reduction, though as I'm writing the script, I am not sure that reducing the duration actually did that much for me, since Andariel was so likely to just keep poisoning me over and over anyway. But I had also saved that poison resist dagger. Now it required a bit more dexterity than I currently had, but I had saved a ring in my stash for exactly this type of situation, a plain ring with 15 dexterity, which was enough for me to equip the Chris. Then, to be on the safe side, I also ran up my tab at Akara's shop for a lot of antidote potions for a temporary boost to poison resistance. I engaged Andariel, and I guess I should have kept one more antidote in spare, because the Merc got poisoned right away. I did manage to turn Andariel away from her quickly though, and a handful of potions managed to keep Amplisa alive. Despite me having 82% poison resistance, Andariel was out-damaging my healing potions, but with such a big life pool she drained me very slowly, and with a few full rejuvenations to go along with my health potions, I kept Andariel busy while my Hurricane and Amplisa chipped away at her, and before long the first boss of hell was defeated. Absolutely atrocious loot drops, but I didn't let that bother me and instead quickly moved on to Act 2. I was doing pretty well in the desert, walking in circles and letting Hurricane tick enemies down. I now fully embraced skipping cold immunes, and that gave me an interesting idea. I used the plus 15 dexterity ring to equip the dagger for the Andariel fight, and I did have a couple of very mediocre dexterity large charms too. And that together with the Sander's boots was actually enough for me to equip the Weisenrow bow that I found way back. I could still use Spirit to cast my spells at an elevated skill level, and then swap to the Weisenrow to dish out increased cold damage by reducing enemy resistance. The build was really starting to come together at this point. Come together to what, you ask? Well, I wasn't sure to be honest, but at least it felt like I was putting some sort of coherent build together. Without a shield, my resistances were absolutely garbage now, but that didn't really matter as long as I kept Cyclone Armor up and had a few antidotes with me in my inventory, and the added damage from Weisenrow was really noticeable. It maybe doesn't look like much, but while playing I could really tell the difference it made, especially against enemies that were highly resistant to cold but not completely immune, like this cold enchanted Beetle Elite. I was really enjoying this significant damage upgrade. But then I entered the Clawwiper Temple, and that place was a disaster because the snakes were immune to cold damage, as were the skeletons which clogged up the area. I tried running past them, but with many tight passages that didn't quite work out the way I hoped to, and I never made it very far before I got either blocked off in a doorway or completely surrounded and stuck. And please, I could technically kill cold immunes, but with so many skeletons that got healed by mummies over and over, and then the snakes with high damage and knockback, it just didn't work out. After several attempts I did manage to run through level 1 and down to level 2. I went around the elite snake fang skin and then went straight for the altar for the quest. But the game was prepared and put a mummy literally blocking the stairs up to the altar. I tried my best to get the mummy to move out of the way, but I just couldn't get through and I had to save and exit the game to not die. But eventually I did have another successful run through the first level where the stairs were not blocked on the second level, and my defensive bulk was absolutely crucial for letting me run through snakes like this. I grabbed the amulet of the Viper and got out as quickly as I could. I was ready to move on towards Duriel, but Amplisa died so much on those run-through attempts that I ended up completely broke afterwards, not even having gold for one more Amplisa. So first I had to farm up a bit of a gold reserve. I went to the far oasis and killed beetles over and over for valuable drops to sell. I found a lum room while doing this, which could perhaps come in useful later. And the reason that I needed Amplisa to continue was these guys, Cold Immune Ghoulords in the Arcane Sanctuary, because here running past everything was pretty much impossible due to the narrow platforms. Amplisa's usefulness and damage was falling off hard at this point, but doing it this way was my only way through that I could think of. A little while later we entered Duriel's lair, and given the chance it took Amplisa down very quickly, but when we returned for the second round I managed to position Amplisa safely outside of Duriel's Holy Freeze aura and got him to push me up against the wall, creating a stable situation where it was my health pool against Duriel's with few surprises. And this fight is a great example of how bad Oak Sage ends up being later in the game. No matter where I summon the spirit, it just loved to run into Duriel and get one-tapped. I was still resummoning the Oak Sage often, but at this point it was annoying me more than it was helping me. But Oak Sage complaints aside, the fight against Duriel went very well. He just didn't muster up enough damage to work through my life pool quickly enough for me to run out of potions. And the crushing blow from the Rattle Cage on Amplisa was putting in a lot of work here. And then Hurricane together with Amplisa's fire arrows could finish off Duriel's HP without too long of a fight. So far, so good in Hell. Honestly, it was going better than I had expected. But of course it would only get tougher from here on out. I don't have much to tell from the third act. The build kept being very high variance depending on if enemies were cold immune or not. Amplisa was pretty much useless now unless I could create situations similar to the Duriel fight where she could stand and fire completely uninterrupted while I tanked. Let's just say that I appreciated my tankiness letting me run through a lot of damage. Once again, Cyclone Armor was absolutely clutch against Mephisto, making me very safe as long as I remember to cast the armor again before it ran out. walking at the edge of his melee range to trick him into casting elemental spells into my elemental shield. I was able to defeat Mephisto, and honestly the entire third act of Hell was pretty uneventful. I might even go out on a limb and claim that it was easy, so when I moved on to the next act I did so with high hopes and high confidence. But then I entered the Chaos Sanctuary in Hell, and that was hell. So many strong enemies, and the most annoying of them all, the Oblivion Knights, were all immune to cold damage. I had not bothered to keep Amplisa with me for most of the third act, but here I was forced to rely on her again, because running past enemies was not going to work, since I had to activate all the seals here and defeat the Seal Guardians, which would probably involve some kiting. There was just no way around it, but slow and steady, with an emphasis on slow, Amplisa chipped away at the cold immune enemies from the safety of my tankiness. And to backtrack just a little bit, I got a Mail Rune from the Hellforge, but I couldn't find any interesting uses for it, so it just collected dust in my stash. A Lem Rune or even an Rune could have been a big damage upgrade for Amplisa, but it wasn't meant to be. The Vizier of Chaos was quick work, not resisting my cold damage and not dealing that much damage on its own, and being a bit flimsy compared to other monsters. Then I struggled through a few more Oblivion Knights before approaching Lord Disease, and would you look at that, cold and fire immune. Meaning that not only was Hurricane useless, so was Amplisa's fire bow skills, so this miniboss had to be dealt with only Amplisa's pitiful base damage. But on the other hand, with all the minions around him taken care of before taking on Disease himself, I could tank him safely, so it was just a matter of time. And in the grand scheme of things, having safe fights at the end of Hell was not bad at all. And then unfortunately, it was a repeat with the Infector of Souls, cold and fire immune. Well, at this point I was completely committed to this attempt because I had spent so much time clearing out the Chaos Sanctuary already, so I just had to wait it out, and I eventually defeated him and summoned Diablo, who once again was not the biggest problem in the Chaos Sanctuary thanks to his wonky lightning attack hitbox, though I had completely ran out of rejuvenation potions at this point, which meant that I had to occasionally run away from the fight to let my health potions heal me back up. But all in all, not the most difficult Diablo fight. And eventually he couldn't stand up to the cold weather anymore and dropped to the floor. No fun loot once again, and I felt a bit unlucky with boss loot in Hell so far, but the real prize was of course that I got to leave the Chaos Sanctuary and the Oblivion Knights behind, forever. The start of the final act was going perfectly fine, but then in the ice caves of Act 5, there were so many cold immunes. The loot goblin in me really wanted to take a 10-hour grind detour to power up Amplisa with some new gear to handle this, but it was not what this particular challenge was all about, so I just ran past everything instead. Except doors. I did battle some fierce doors in Act 5. It was tough, but every time I walked away from the encounter as the victor, and then I walked through the busted in door. I feared that the Ancients would be one of the tougher fights for this character, since you can't go back to town in the middle of combat, but with fights being so long, it required me to have lots of healing supplies. I began by resetting the fight a few times, hoping for no cold immune barbarians, but of course Corlic is always cold immune in Hell, so that was not going to work. Soon I got a spawn, which at first glance didn't have any too strong stat combinations and got to work. I managed to separate them and started working on Corlic first. Mana burn was annoying, but not too dangerous. Cursed is dangerous, but it seemed fine since its damage wasn't boosted by anything else, like extra strong or an aura. But I made a mistake. I had saved up all rejuvenation potions I had found during the act, but I forgot them all except 2 in my stash. And that was just not going to work since my health potions only managed to slow the demise of my health pool. I needed the occasional rejuve to tank. So I did one more reset despite the fight looking decent. For the second proper attempt, I once took Corlic on first. He was really slow to take down, but I could do so without requiring too many resources. It took 5 minutes to take Corlic down this way, but I was happy to spend time rather than potions for this fight. Then I faced Madoc, who was really easy. Teleport could screw up the battle if he teleported towards his remaining friend, but it ended working out fine this time, and he fell in just a couple of minutes. But then I made another mistake for this attempt. I had not scouted Talik beforehand, and he was absolutely horrible. Amplisa died right away, and while I was desperately trying to position myself at the ledge to trick him into not using Whirlwind, I died with several rejuves left in my belt. I felt a bit stupid in the moment, but it was actually probably for the best, because with how much damage I was taking with each hit, I'm not sure I could have outlasted him, so it might have been a waste of rejuves. But the third time's the charm, right? Right? No. Talik got me again. Both Madoc and Corlic had spawned extra strong this time, so by the time I fought Talik, I had like 8 potions in total left. And then when trying to disengage from the battle, I ran in the same direction as Talik's Whirlwind and died once again. This fight defeated me a little bit and I gave up. But only temporarily. After a long break from the game and a short detour back to earlier acts to farm for more purple potions, I tried again. Corlic, Stone Skin. It took Ampliza a long time to wear him down, but I was able to tank him well. I did use a lot of potions though, but this time I was a smart goblin and finally put some extra on the floor before the fight. I really should have brought more, but more on that soon. Then I took Madokon, who was extra strong, and I guess Talik must have been cursed because I'm not sure where else that curse came from, and facing cursed plus extra strong was not a feasible combo to fight, so I had to run around dodging axes until the curse ran out. But after the curse did run out, Madok was fairly easy, even if I did have to use a lot of potions once again. And then it was only Talik, who was indeed cursed, and that was a problem. He killed Ampliza basically immediately, but I also got a little lucky and managed to get him into a position where he only attacked me in melee and did not use Whirlwind. But even then, because of the curse, I was not able to endure the endless flailing of his sword, and with a decent amount of Talik's life pool left, I completely ran out of health potions and had to start running away. I really did not want to restart this fight again. I had been fighting the Ancient for well over an hour in total by now, ramming my head against the wall, so I really focused, locked in as they say, and danced around Talik, trying to get Hurricane to hit him at the edge of its range while also avoiding Talik's attacks. This was a really intense end to the battle, but in the end I managed to stay alive and took Talik down. And when it was all done I drew a sigh of relief, because this was one of the worst Ancients fights I've ever had. And as a final attempt from the Ancients to hinder my progress, I inexplicably got stuck in Madok's statue when trying to move towards the Worldstone Keep. And I'm not kidding, I was just walking by and got completely locked into place. Luckily a TP to town got me loose, but the game was really doing everything in its power to stop me from finishing this challenge. After the Ancients, I simply ran through the Worldstone Keep as fast as I could and reached the Throne of Destruction, where I was greeted by Oblivion Knights again. Sigh, I thought I had seen the last of those. But this time it was actually even worse than the Chaos Sanctuary, because there were also mummies, which can heal any undead enemy, including the Oblivion Knights. Well, lucky for me, there was an alternate path I could take, because I was not gonna fight through Oblivion Knights with endless healing. Out of Baal's minions, only 2 of the waves caused trouble for me. First wave number 2, which was tedious because of the cold immune skeleton mages, backed up by healing mummies. I had to drag the skeletons away from the mummies, let Ampliza take them down, and then make sure that the Carrion Vine ate them to prevent their perpetual resurrection. And then wave number 5. Lister and the Minions of Destruction are strong but slow. I was expecting this fight to take a long time, but I was also feeling pretty confident. That was until I noticed that Lister had spawned with the Might Aura and was immune to cold damage. At this point, I decided that I had had enough of this run and simply skipped them. And then finally, Baal. The final boss was so tanky that he made me look like a glass cannon, and his spells were as annoying as ever. But just like me, he had messed up his build by going for all-out defense and too low offense, so he wasn't able to take me down. After what my recording software tells me was just over 13 minutes of this. I defeated Baal, and with him, the challenge. 13 minutes is actually not the worst I've had against Baal in hell by some margin, but it was just so awful to not attack, but still having to walk after him to ensure that he stayed in the hurricane. If I hadn't looked the time up, I could have sworn it to be double of what it actually was. And you can tell I was really done with this run, because I didn't even look at Baal's drops before going into the portal, and I'm the loot goblin. For all I know, maybe he dropped a Tyrael's Might. I'd like to take a moment to anti-thank myself for coming up with the dumbest build I've ever played. But a big actual thanks to all the supporters on YouTube and Twitch. And thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next video, where I will be playing a character that's A, allowed to attack, and B, not a druid.